In 260 AC, Barristan Selmy found himself cutting through the most famous sellsword company in the world. He was 23 years old. He had no white cloak, no place in the King's Guard, and none of the legend that would follow him into Game of Thrones. Ahead of him stood Maelys Blackfyre. Maelys had arms strong enough to kill a warhorse with one blow. A second, smaller head grew from his neck. He commanded the Golden Company and claimed the Iron Throne as the last known male line pretender of House Blackfyre. Barristan reached him. The books tell us that the two men met in single combat, and that Barristan killed him. They do not tell us what either man said, how long the duel lasted, or which blow ended it. What they do tell us is enough. One young knight walked away with a place in history. One branch of a royal family ended in the male line. Several other survivors would meet again during a much more familiar rebellion. To understand why Barristan had to reach Maelys, we need a short trip back to Redgrass Field. Only a short one. We have already watched this family lose the same argument several times. Our second video followed Daemon Blackfyre, the first man to claim that his branch of the Targaryen family should rule Westeros. Daemon died at Redgrass with his two eldest sons. His surviving family escaped across the narrow sea with Bittersteel and the sword that had given their house its name. Our third video followed what happened next. Bittersteel built the Golden Company to keep the Blackfyre exiles together. The company could earn its living in other people's wars, then return whenever a new Blackfyre prince was ready. It survived failed invasions. It survived Bittersteel himself. The last video ended with those sails moving west. This one follows them. By the time Maelys took command, Daemon I had been dead for more than 60 years. Bittersteel's skull had been dipped in gold and carried with the army he founded. The old family sword had disappeared from the surviving record. That last point matters. The published books never say Maelys carried Blackfyre. They do not tell us where the sword was in 260 AC. Maelys had the name, the company, and a claim through the male line. We should not quietly add the sword because it would look good in the duel. He hardly needed help looking dangerous. Maelys was built on a scale that even the histories found difficult to describe politely. His torso and arms were grotesquely large. Beside his main head was a second head, no larger than a child's fist. Years later, the Golden Company carried two skulls on the pike reserved for Maelys, his large malformed skull and the tiny skull of his nameless twin. Maelys became known as the Monstrous for his body, strength, and violence. He proved the last part while fighting his own cousin. That cousin was also named Daemon Blackfyre. He was a later descendant, not the Daemon from Redgrass. The two men fought for command of the Golden Company. Maelys killed Daemon's horse with a punch, then killed Daemon by twisting his head from his shoulders. The company accepted its new captain general. It was a brutal change of command, but command of a sellsword army was still not a kingdom. For that, Maelys needed partners. He found 8. In 258 AC, 9 ambitious men and women met beneath the Tree of Crowns in the disputed lands. They were an odd collection. There were pirate captains, exiles, and sellswords. One was an ambitious merchant prince from Tyrosh. Another was an exiled prince from the Summer Isles. One called herself the Old Mother. Their titles were often grander than the land they controlled. Each member wanted a kingdom. Together, they made a simple agreement: help the other 8 win theirs, and all 9 might end with crowns. Maelys chose the largest prize. He wanted Westeros. When news reached King's Landing, Prince Duncan Targaryen joked that crowns must be selling 9 a penny. This was Prince Duncan, Aegon V's eldest son, not Sir Duncan the Tall. Both men died at Summerhall the following year. The joke stayed. The alliance became the Ninepenny Kings. At first, the name made them sound cheaper than dangerous. King Aegon V and many of his advisors expected the group to collapse in Essos. 9 ambitious people promising one another. 9 kingdoms does contain several obvious opportunities for disagreement. The crown still prepared against a Blackfyre landing. That caution proved useful because the 9 did not collapse. They overran the disputed lands. They sacked Tyrosh and installed their merchant prince, Aliquo Aerys, as its ruler. Then they seized the Stepstones. Those islands sit between Dorne and the Free Cities. They are dry, rocky, and scattered across busy sea lanes. Holding them gave Maelys a base close to Westeros, with the Golden Company already under his command. The joke no longer worked. Maelys now held the islands from which he could sail for Westeros. Then, the Iron Throne changed hands. In 239 AC, Aegon V died in the fire at Summerhall. Prince Duncan died there too, along with Sir Duncan the Tall and many others. Rhaegar Targaryen was born during the disaster. That was the end of our first video. For this story, it was also a sudden change in government during a growing foreign crisis. Aegon's son Jaehaerys inherited the Iron Throne. Jaehaerys was thin and often sick, so people underestimated him. He did not lack courage. Once the Band of Nine held the Stepstones, he decided that waiting had become more dangerous than fighting. Maelys would not be allowed to choose the landing place. Jaehaerys wanted to lead the royal army himself. His hand, Lord Ormond Baratheon, persuaded him to remain in Westeros and took command in his place. The response drew men from across the Seven Kingdoms. Lord Quelyn Greyjoy brought 100 longships from the Iron Islands. Dorne sent spears. The Westerlands supplied 1,000 knights and 10,000 men-at-arms under Sir Jason Lannister. Among the thousands were several young men whose names casual viewers will recognize. Prince Aerys was 16. He was handsome, energetic, and still 2 years away from becoming king. Nobody on those ships called him the Mad King. His close friend Tywin Lannister was a young knight from a family weakened by his father's poor rule. Steffon Baratheon served as a squire. He was Ormond's son, Aerys' cousin, and another of Tywin's closest friends. Brynden Tully, the future Blackfish, was there. So was Barristan Selmy, already a knight after years of entering tourneys far too young. They sailed south to stop Maelys before his war reached their homes. What followed was months of fighting across rocky islands and the surrounding sea. The royal host landed in 260 AC. Fighting continued for most of the year, both on land and at sea. The histories mention many battles, but the published books give us only pieces of the campaign. That gap is important. We know who commanded, who died, and who emerged with a reputation. We do not have a reliable route for every army, or a complete order for every clash. So there will be no invented master plan here in which Tywin predicts every move and Barristan wins the war before breakfast. What survives is harsh enough. Lord Ormond Baratheon became one of the first great casualties. Maelys killed him in battle. Ormond died in the arms of his son. Steffon had crossed the sea as a squire. He was now Lord of Storm's End, with no journey home available until the campaign was won. Command of the royal army passed to Sir Gerald Hightower, the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard. The Westermen suffered their own loss on Bloodstone, one of the largest islands. Sir Jason Lannister was killed there. Lord Roger Rayne took command of the surviving Westermen and led them to several victories. Tywin fought in that same army. Within a year, Roger Rayne and Tywin Lannister would stand on opposite sides of another conflict. For the moment, they had a common enemy. The histories say Aerys, Tywin, Steffon, Brynden, and several other young men distinguished themselves. They rarely tell us what each man actually did. That makes restraint necessary. We can show them fighting. We can show the conditions that earned them reputations. We cannot give Aerys a fictional duel or invent a clever speech for Tywin. The campaign created several new reputations. Its ordinary soldiers carried home a different story. Years later, Brienne of Tarth traveled through a riverlands ruined by another war. Her guide was a barefoot septon named Meribald. Meribald had gone to the Stepstones as a boy. His older brother Willem jokingly accepted him as a squire. Their brothers Robin and Owen went too. 4 brothers left home together. Willem and Robin died of fever. Owen died in battle. Owen's friend was hanged for rape. Meribald came back alone. The books strongly suggest that he became one of the broken men he later described to Brienne. Frightened soldiers who had lost their leaders and purpose. When someone asked Meribald about the War of the Ninepenny Kings, he gave a better summary than most court histories. He had seen no king and earned no penny. It had still been a war. For Barristan or Brynden, the Stepstones became the beginning of a heroic reputation. Meribald remembered sickness and brothers who never came home. Both versions belong in the story. The campaign still had to be decided, and Barristan's part began near the Golden Company's lines. Maelys was the only member of the 9 whose promised kingdom lay across the narrow sea. The others had joined him because the agreement might win each of them a realm. They had little personal interest in who sat the Iron Throne. That made Maelys the link between their alliance and the invasion of Westeros. Kill him, and the band could still defend its holdings. It would lose its reason to sail west. The Golden Company stood between Barristan and the claimant. Later accounts say Barristan cut his way through their ranks until he reached Maelys. That is the solid part of the story. The duel itself survives only as an outcome. We do not know whether Maelys carried an axe, a sword, or another weapon in that final encounter. We do not know whether Barristan was wounded. There is no confirmed exchange of boasts, and no watching army politely stopped its own battle to admire them. Barristan Selmy killed Maelys Blackfyre in single combat. With Maelys died the last known male line of the Blackfyre pretenders. That wording matters. The books establish the end of the male line. They do not prove that every possible descendant through a daughter had vanished. The Iron Throne had faced claimants descended from Daemon I for more than 6 decades. Bloodraven had tried to end them with arrows, spies, prisons, and one broken promise. Bittersteel had kept finding another prince. On the Stepstones, the supply finally ran out. The rest of the band had kingdoms of its own to defend. Its members withdrew from the attempt on Westeros. Their alliance and holdings took longer to collapse, and Aliquo Aerys remained in Tyrosh for 6 more years. Maelys's attempt on the Iron Throne was over. The Golden Company was not. It left the Stepstones without a Blackfyre king, carried on fighting in Essos, and kept Maelys among the gilded skulls of its dead captains. Bittersteel's institution had survived the last male heir it was built to support. Barristan returned to Westeros famous. When a place opened in the Kingsguard, King Jaehaerys gave him the White Cloak. Barristan accepted, even though he was heir to Harvest Hall and expected to marry. Service to the royal family became the rest of his life. He would later rescue Aerys from Duskendale, fight for Rhaegar at the Trident, accept Robert Baratheon's pardon, and cross the sea to find Daenerys. All of that came after the Stepstones. Brynden Tully also returned with a name people remembered. The books say he proved himself a great knight, although they never identify one defining feat. Years later, a young Jaime Lannister would ignore the girl his father hoped he might marry and beg Brynden for stories about Maelys. Some war stories have more staying power than courtship. Prince Aerys left the islands as a knight. At 16, he chose Tywin to give him his spurs. 2 years later, Aerys became king and appointed his old friend as hand. Their early rule began with real promise. The friendship later curdled into envy, humiliation, and suspicion, until Tywin's son killed Aerys beneath the Iron Throne. None of that future was obvious while Tywin fastened his friend's spurs. Steffon Baratheon returned as Lord of Storm's End. His first son, Robert, was born 2 years after the war. The boy would grow up close to Ned Stark, rebel against Aerys, and kill Rhaegar on the Trident. The friendships of the Stepstones would not survive into their children's generation. Tywin went home to the Westerlands. In 261 AC, he destroyed Houses Rhaen and Tarbeck after they rebelled against his father's authority. Only months earlier, Roger Rhaen had commanded Westermen after Jason Lannister's death and won victories for the crown. Shared enemies had never guaranteed lasting friendship in Westeros, and Meribald returned without Willem, Robin, or Owen. The songs remembered Barristan fighting Maelys. Meribald remembered boys who died of fever before they could meet a king. The War of the Ninepenny Kings is sometimes called the 5th Blackfyre Rebellion. That label makes sense as a shortcut. Maelys was the 5th Blackfyre pretender, and the Golden Company intended to win Westeros for him. The published books use another name. They remember the pirates and sellswords who promised one another cheap crowns. They remember a war fought on barren islands before the invaders could reach the 7 kingdoms. They remember it as the War of the Ninepenny Kings. It ended the clear male line Blackfyre threat. It made Barristan Selmy a legend. It gave the future Blackfish his first fame. It also put young Aerys, Tywin, and Steffon on the same side for the last great war of their youth. 23 years later, Aerys sat the Iron Throne. Tywin stood outside King's Landing with an army. Steffon's son Robert was fighting to take the crown, and Barristan was bleeding for the dynasty he had sworn to protect. The men who defeated Maelys later became kings, fathers, hands, and sworn swords. Their loyalties changed with them. The Blackfyre War was over. The next rebellion would be fought by its survivors and their sons.